Hello, everybody. Welcome to Greek 1. We are at the end. This is lesson 14. We're talking about relative pronouns today. And this is going to be the last lesson for Greek 1. Greek 2 starts with lesson 15. And we're going to be jumping into the verbs system. But anyway, I'm glad we're here. I hope you feel like you're learning something. You're able to read a little bit. And you can finish off strong. All right, so today we are talking about relative pronouns. Again, we're going to finish off on a pretty easy lesson. Basically, a relative pronoun is, who, which, that, whoever, whose, etc. And it's honestly that simple. There's some grammar we're going to talk about at the end. But the relative pronouns, you already know them. So look at this chart. I'm going to give you a bigger version here in a little bit. But you've got basically the same thing we've been looking at the entire course. They are inflected with meaning just like everything else. So you have your nominatives. Genitive would be of whom. The dative would be to whom. Your accusative would be whom. It's funny because a lot of people don't know how to use who and whom in English. Whom is the accusative. It's the direct object of the sentence. Who is the subject. And so, so you would say to whom. And you would say who to whom. Anyway, so those are relative pronouns. Now, if you compare them to the case endings, they're almost identical. So there's a few differences. If you're looking at the neuter, you'll notice that the neuter nominative singular and the neuter accusative singular ends in ni. The relative pronoun does not have the ni at the end of it. And that's pretty much it. Everything else is the endings we've been looking at for the entire semester or the entire course. So the only other difference here is a highlight. The only other difference is that you have the rough breathing mark on the relative pronouns. And honestly, this makes it so much easier to identify them. That rough breathing mark and the accent together is what tell you that it's a relative pronoun versus, sometimes these will look like the article, or you might get them confused for other things. But it's pretty easy. If you see an ending hanging out by itself and it's got a rough breathing mark and an accent, then that's a relative pronoun. And that's about it. The relative pronoun, all the relative pronouns have that rough breathing mark and accent. The accents are different. This is called the circumflex. Sometimes they have the grave, sometimes the acute, but they all have both one of the accents, and they also will definitely have the rough breathing mark. So here's the chart a little larger. You can see them, and you can see how they're translated. Who, which, that, of whom, of which, of whose, and you just go down the line, and that is it. There's not really anything to dwell on as far as how to identify the relative pronoun, and that's it. It's a totality. So basically, it's everything you've learned now, and all you do is add the rough breathing mark with an accent, and you've got the relative pronoun, and it means who, which, that. If it's in the genitive, you add the of. If it's a dative, it's to. And if it's the accusative, then it's a direct object, so it would be whom. And that is it. So now I'm going to spend the rest of this short little lesson talking about the grammar behind it, and it'll help you a little bit with how to translate. And of course, if you have the workbook and you're watching the workbook videos, which I highly encourage, you'll get a lot more of this. Okay, let's talk about the antecedent. That's a cool word. Maybe it's like an action movie or something like that. I don't know. So you might remember that a pronoun replaces a noun. So if we have a sentence like, George is a good man, he is great, the word he in this sentence is substituting in for George. That is, you don't have to say George is a good man, George is great. Once you've introduced your topic in a paragraph, right? You say George is a good man. You can use he for the rest of the paragraph. As long as you know you're talking about George, you can say he is all day long. The noun that a pronoun is referring to is the antecedent. So he is the pronoun, and then remember George, he is the antecedent noun. That word George is the antecedent noun. The pronoun is replacing the antecedent, and so that's what those words mean. In English, you have to match the pronoun and the antecedent in gender and number. So, for example, you couldn't say George is a good man, she is great. You would say, who is she? It's obviously not referring to George because it doesn't match in gender. You also couldn't say George is a good man, they are great, because they is plural. There's more than one, so it can't be referring to George. So in English, you have to match the gender and number to the antecedent, whatever it is you're talking about, which is George. Since George is masculine and singular, then your pronoun has to match it in gender and number. All right, now let's talk about Greek. Greek is actually the same way. In Greek, you have to match in number and gender as well. So we have diu ke epiisen tu eonas. You might remember that D is through, and we just learned the relative pronoun ou. Ou is who in the genitive. Now it's in the genitive because it's attached to a preposition, so we're not going to say of whom. We're just going to say through whom. Que is and even also, namely. In this case, it's also. So through whom. Epiisen, you haven't learned this word yet, is he made tous eonas, which is the ages or the world in this case. So this sentence in Greek is through whom he also made the world. All right, un is he. It's replacing something. Now it's in the nominative, it's in the genitive, and it is singular and it is masculine. So if you were to look at the context, I took this out of the letter to the Hebrews. This is obviously talking about the word Jesus, who created all things. So it's going to match in number and gender. Okay. In Greek, one more thing is added. The case of the relative pronoun, whether it's a dative, a genitive, a nominative, it depends on the function, on what it's doing in the sentence. So this is important because it's not going to be in the case of the antecedent. So suppose, for example, George was in that case would be in the nominative. The pronoun does not have to be in the nominative as well. It has to be the same number and gender. So because George is masculine singular, the pronoun has to be masculine singular. But the pronoun can do something besides be a subject of the sentence. So it doesn't have to be the nominative. It could be a genitive like it is in this case. It could be a dative. It could be anything else. So even though it's matching in number and gender, the case of the pronoun, of the relative pronoun, can be anything because it can do other things. Let's look at an example here. So here we have something from John 1:1. O in archis, o akikoamen, o eurakamen, eurakamen tis ophthalmis imon. And notice that here you've got the relative pronoun 3 times. And this is the beginning of First John, the letter of First John, and there is no antecedent here. So my last little note here is often the antecedent is not actually mentioned in the passage. You don't even have Jesus' name in here. So or it's later on, or it came quite a bit before. So in this case, it's talking about the word of life, and it says "O in ap archi," from beginning, and this would be something like "He who from the beginning, which we heard, which we saw with our own eyes," and so you would translate it. So this is masculine in English. But if we read the whole passage, we would know that it is talking about o logos, which is the word of life. And so even though in Greek, logos is masculine, in English, the word is neuter. So we would not say he referring to the word, although you could. Usually this is translated which. So just be aware that just because it's masculine in Greek does not mean it's masculine in English. It's grammatical gender, not natural gender. So just be mindful of that. In any case, notice here that we're using the relative pronoun without an antecedent. So we've got a few things to remember. First of all, the relative pronoun replaces a noun. The noun it is referring to is called the antecedent. The relative pronoun must match the antecedent in gender and number. In Greek, the relative pronoun must match in number and gender, just like in English. But the case of the relative pronoun, it just depends on what that relative pronoun is doing. Remember, that relative pronoun could be in the direct object, indirect object. It could be showing possession. It could be the object of a preposition. It could be doing a million things. So the case has nothing to do with an antecedent. The case has nothing to do with the noun it's replacing. And then often the antecedent is not actually spelled out in the passage. So just be aware of those things, that you'll just have a relative pronoun and you're hunting for an antecedent. It might not be in that sentence. It may not be in that paragraph, and it may not be there at all. So just be aware of those things. Sometimes you have to just know from context what the relative pronoun is actually talking about. All right, we're almost to the end here. The last thing I want to talk about is clauses, and mostly not because this is really a big deal in our current topic, but because when we're going through the workbook, this is going to be really important. Remember that a sentence has a subject and a verb, right? So we'll say Jose plays the guitar. A clause is a sentence within a sentence. That is, you can add another subject and verb within this sentence to add more information. So for example, I could say Jose, who loves Jesus, plays the guitar. Now notice you could have a sentence like Jose loves Jesus, and you have another sentence which Jose plays the guitar. All right. Well, you can use a relative pronoun inside of the sentence to make that other sentence a clause within the first sentence. So if we had that sentence, Jose plays the guitar, and another sentence, Jose loves Jesus, you just take that first one of those sentences and take the Jose and make that into a relative pronoun. You substitute it with a relative pronoun, and you can slap that guy in there and just say, Jose, who loves Jesus? Now, in this case, who is the relative pronoun that is the subject of that little clause. Who loves Jesus? You've got an actual sentence there. The only difference is that the subject is not the name Jose. It is the relative pronoun. And it is inside the bigger actual sentence, which is Jose plays the guitar. So Jose plays the guitar is still the actual sentence, but you have within that sentence a smaller clause. And that clause has its own subject, verb, and direct object. So Jesus is the direct object of the verb to love, and who is the subject. So notice you've got a sentence within a sentence, and we will call that a clause. That little sentence inside of that sentence is called a clause. Let's get another example. We say, George is great at Greek. All right, we can throw in another sentence within there. We just need a relative pronoun, and we're going to substitute George with a relative pronoun who, and we'll say who is an amazing cook. So George, who is an amazing cook, is great at Greek. So we've got the basic original sentence, which is George is great at Greek. And then we had another sentence we want to throw in there. George is an amazing cook. How do we add that in there? Well, we use a relative pronoun to substitute the subject, which is George. So now it's not, rather than Jorge or George is an amazing cook, now we're going to say who is an amazing cook, and we're just going to throw it right in there. You can do that a million times if you wanted to. So a clause can turn an entire sentence like who he sings like an angel into a single subject, into a direct object or an indirect object. So you can take an entire clause and make it the subject. Art, who sings like an angel, does not want to sing in the choir, which meets every week. So notice we can just kind of keep adding and adding. And this time, which meets every week, is referring to the choir. What is choir in that sentence? Well, if you piece it together, in the choir is a prepositional phrase. Choir is the object of a preposition. If the preposition is in, which it is, then choir is the object of that preposition. So, which meets every week is a part of that choir, right? So it's like an apposition to it, is connected to that. So it's one big long sentence that's just an object of a preposition. So that's how clauses work. You can take, and that's why you get these long, complicated sentences. And if you remember at the beginning, we said a sentence is just a subject and a verb, but you get these sentences that have a lot more. Well, that's where clauses come in, because you can add clauses and clauses describing each little word in a sentence to make it more complicated. So now you're getting the idea of how clauses can add more and more. Clauses are individual sentences that are within larger sentences, and that clause can act. The whole sentence can be your subject. The whole sentence can be your direct object or your indirect object or an object of the preposition. It can do a lot of different things. So hopefully that's making sense. And remember that if you're working through your workbook, all these things can become a lot clearer because we'll go through examples together. So let's review real quick. In this short lesson, we just talked about what the relative pronoun is. You already know those endings. Those are just the endings that we've been talking about this entire course. Those are the case endings. The only difference that you have to watch out for is that the nominative singular neuter, the accusative singular neuter, instead of having the ni at the end, so it's on, it just has o. And so that could look like an article, but remember, if it has the rough breathing mark, that is, if the breathing mark is opening towards the right, that's not an article, that is a relative pronoun. It's replacing something else. And you can make that relative pronoun, it can introduce an entire clause. So that's why we got into clauses, because that relative pronoun can have its own sentence within another sentence, and that is called a clause. It doesn't always have to, it could just be the relative pronoun by itself, but if it's a clause, it's going to have its own subject and verb, and it could be a complicated one, and then that whole clause can act as a subject of your bigger sentence. It could be the direct object of your bigger sentence or your main sentence. It could be anything else. I should say anything, but it can act as a lot of different things. And so that is clauses. All right, everybody. Well, congratulations. You made it to the end. Well, you still have the workbook to go through and your vocabulary and yeah, all that. But you made it through your last lesson at least. So from here, what's next? Well, remember, Greek 2 is going to start with, I'll have a course overview that'll be Greek 2 lesson 1. I don't want you to be confused because after that, it'll be Greek 2 lesson 15. So it goes from 1 to 15. And again, why am I doing that? It's because I'm trying to follow the chapter numbers that Mounts uses in his intro, Basics of Biblical Greek. So that's why I'm using those numbers. That's why it's going to start. I'll have lesson 1, a course overview of what Greek 2 is about, but then you're going to jump right in. You're going to go all the way to lesson 15, and that's going to be that's going to match up with Mounts. It's the same exact textbooks you've been using, same workbook, same text. Obviously, you're not even halfway through that first text. So take a short break. I would say 1 to 2 weeks, 3 weeks max. You start taking a month off and you're going to forget everything you learned. So you could take 1 week break. You could take a 2 week break. I'm not crazy about the idea of 3, but if you're really burnt out and you just need to do something, if you got, visits or anything you got to do, sure. But I do want to see you soon. I want you to be productive and keep going with Greek so you just refine it. And yeah. Well, anyway, congratulations. And until next time, Godspeed.